morning sun reflected off the crystalline towers of the Galactic Institute of Advanced Engineering as Kyle Harrison walked through the main entrance. He was a human, and humans were still very new to this part of the galaxy. Kyle carried his admission papers in one hand and a small backpack in the other. He felt nervous but also excited. The other students had never seen a human before, and Kyle knew that today would change everything for him. The Institute was the most famous school in the entire galaxy. For 300 years, it had taught the best engineers from hundreds of different species. The buildings were made of materials that could change color and shape. The hallways were filled with beings that looked nothing like Kyle. Some were tall and thin with crystal-like skin that glowed different colors. Others floated in the air like clouds of gas and smoke. A few were covered in thick armor and walked with heavy steps that made the ground shake. Kyle found his way to the classroom where he would take his first lesson. The room was huge and had seats arranged in a circle. The professor was already there, waiting. His name was Professor Aldrin, and he was a member of the crystalline species. His body looked like it was made of blue and purple glass, and light moved through him like he was made of water and ice combined. Professor Aldrin looked at Kyle for a long moment. He did not say hello or welcome. Instead, he simply pointed to an empty seat. Kyle sat down quickly, not wanting to make anyone uncomfortable. As more students entered the classroom, Kyle noticed that every single one of them turned to stare at him. Some looked confused. Some looked angry. A few looked curious, but most looked doubtful. One student who sat next to Kyle was very large and covered in thick metal-like armor. His name was Vex, and he was a Vexillian. Vex leaned over and spoke to Kyle in a voice that sounded like metal scraping against stone. He asked Kyle if this was some kind of joke. Vex said that humans were known to be weak and short-lived. How could a human possibly study at such a difficult school? Kyle answered politely that he had studied hard on Earth and passed every test they gave him. He told Vex that he was here because he wanted to learn and help his people become better engineers. Another student was called Zix9, and she was a silicate engineer. Her body was made of shiny crystal that reflected light in beautiful patterns. Zix9 asked Kyle what Earth was really like. She wanted to know if it was true that humans lived on a dangerous planet where things were always trying to kill them. Kyle nodded and explained that Earth was very different from most planets in the galaxy. The weather was dangerous with storms and earthquakes. There were wild animals that could hurt people. There were also diseases that could make people sick and kill them. Because of this, humans had learned to build things very carefully. Every bridge, every building, and every tool had to work perfectly because people's lives depended on it. Professor Aldrin finally started the lesson. He did not waste any time with introductions or welcomes. Instead, he began talking about advanced engineering principles that were so complicated that Kyle's head started to hurt. The professor talked about things like quantum mechanics and energy distribution systems that Kyle had never heard of before. Most of the other students seemed to understand what he was saying, or at least they pretended to understand. They took notes on special devices that recorded everything and translated it into pictures and numbers. As the lesson went on, Kyle realized that the professors and students at this institute used completely different methods than what he had learned on Earth. On Earth, engineers would build something, test it, fix the problems, and then build a better version. They learned by making mistakes and learning from them. But here at the Institute, everything was done through mathematics and simulations. The professors would draw pictures on screens and make calculations. They would run computer programs that showed what would happen if they built something. They never actually built anything with their hands. When the lesson ended, Kyle felt very tired. The other students rushed out of the classroom quickly. No one spoke to Kyle or asked him any questions. He walked slowly to the dormitory where he would be staying. The student housing was beautiful but very strange. His room was small and had walls that could change color depending on his mood. The bed was soft and adjusted itself to fit his body perfectly. There was a window that showed any view he wanted to see, even though Kyle was sure there was no real window at all. That night, Kyle sat on his bed and thought about his first day. He knew that the other students did not believe he belonged here. They thought he was weak and stupid. They probably thought that humans had no business studying at such an important school. Kyle knew that he had to work very hard to prove them wrong. He had to show them that humans had something different to offer. He had to prove that just because humans came from a dangerous planet did not mean they could not be excellent engineers. Kyle opened his computer and started reading the textbooks for his classes. The material was very difficult and much more advanced than anything he had studied before. But Kyle kept reading and kept trying to understand everything. He did not sleep that night. Instead, he studied and studied until the sun came up again in the morning. When Kyle arrived at his second class, Professor Aldrin looked at him and noticed something was different. There was something in Kyle's eyes that showed determination and strength. The professor raised his eyebrow but said nothing. Kyle took his seat, and this time he felt ready. He did not know everything, but he was willing to learn. He was willing to work harder than any other student in the class. He was willing to prove that humans deserved to be here. Vex looked at Kyle again and seemed surprised by the change in him. Even Zix-9 seemed to notice that this human was not going to give up easily. The other students started to realize that maybe having a human in their class would not be such a bad thing after all. They started to wonder what a human mind could think of that their minds had never considered before. Kyle smiled to himself. He knew that his real journey was just beginning. He had passed the first test by simply showing up and not giving up. Now he had to prove that humans could contribute something important and unique to the world of galactic engineering. He had to show everyone that survival on a dangerous planet like Earth had taught humans special skills that could help solve the galaxy's biggest problems. Kyle was ready for whatever came next. The morning after Kyle's first day at the Galactic Institute, Professor Aldrin sat in his office and reviewed the curriculum one more time. He had made a decision that many other professors disagreed with. He had allowed a human to study at their school, even though many believed it was a mistake. The other teachers had warned him that humans were unpredictable. They said humans were too emotional and not logical enough for advanced engineering studies. But Professor Aldrin had seen something special in Kyle's application. He had seen determination and a different way of thinking that the Institute desperately needed. The first assignment would be given today. Professor Aldrin had carefully chosen a problem that would challenge the best students in the class. He wanted to see how Kyle would approach it compared to the other species. The problem was called the Pressure Distribution Challenge, and no student had successfully completed it perfectly for 5 years. It required designing a power system that could handle extreme pressure while keeping energy waste below 10%. On paper, it seemed almost impossible. When Kyle walked into the classroom that morning, the professor handed out the assignment. All the students immediately ran to the computer stations in the back of the room. They started entering data and running calculations through the school's advanced computers. The silicate engineers, like Zix-9, created beautiful mathematical models that were perfect and precise. The Vexillian students analyzed the problem through physical strength calculations. The Zephyrian student named Whisper used energy wave patterns to find solutions. Everyone worked with computers and simulations. But Kyle did something completely different. He asked Professor Aldrin if he could go to the workshop instead. The professor smiled and nodded, giving Kyle permission to leave the classroom. Kyle spent the next hour gathering materials and tools. He found pieces of metal, crystal, and special energy conduits. He started building something with his hands, something real and physical. Vex watched Kyle work through the workshop window. He could not understand why a student would waste time building something real when computers could calculate the answer so much faster. Zix-9 also observed Kyle, confused by his methods. But Professor Aldrin simply watched and waited to see what would happen. Kyle's hands moved quickly but carefully. He had learned to build things on Earth, where there were no perfect simulations and no computers that could predict every outcome. He built a prototype that took all the pressure and spread it through multiple channels instead of one main channel. He used materials that would bend slightly under pressure instead of staying completely rigid. He created something that looked less elegant than the computer models, but it was designed to handle real problems in the real world. After several hours, Kyle finished his prototype. He asked Professor Aldrin to test it in the Institute's pressure chamber. The professor agreed, and soon all the students gathered to watch what would happen. The pressure increased slowly in the chamber, just like in the assignment. Kyle's prototype bent and moved as the pressure increased, but it did not break. The energy remained stable and efficient. The power did not waste away like the computer models predicted it would. When the pressure reached its maximum level, Kyle's design performed better than any theoretical solution anyone had created in years. The classroom went completely silent. No one moved or spoke. They had just watched a human solve a problem that their most advanced computers and their best minds had not been able to solve perfectly. Vex's metal armor made a loud sound as he shifted in his seat. Zix-9's crystal body flashed with different colors as she processed what she had just witnessed. Kyle walked back to his seat calmly, as if he had just done something ordinary. But Professor Aldrin looked at the young human with a new expression. He was impressed. He was also thinking about why this human's approach had succeeded while the theories and computers had not. The answer was becoming clear to him. Kyle thought differently because he came from a place where engineering failures meant death. Kyle built things thinking about what could actually happen, not just what mathematics said should happen. Professor Aldrin announced that Kyle's design was being accepted as the answer to the assignment. He then did something very unusual. He asked all the other students to study Kyle's prototype and understand why it worked better than their calculations. The professor explained that there were many ways to solve problems in engineering. Computers and mathematics were important, but practical thinking and real-world experience were equally important. Sometimes the best solution came from building something real and testing it rather than only working with numbers and theories. After class, several students approached Kyle. They wanted to know where he had learned to build things like that. They wanted to understand how his mind worked. For the first time since Kyle had arrived at the institute, the other students were looking at him with respect instead of doubt. They were starting to understand that being a human from a death world was not a weakness. It was actually a completely different and valuable perspective that no other species at the institute had ever really considered before. Vex stood very close to Kyle and asked him a direct question. The Vexillian wanted to know how Kyle could think about problems in such a different way. Kyle explained that on Earth, people could not rely on perfect mathematical calculations because real-world conditions were always more complicated than the math suggested. Rain fell harder than predicted. Wind blew stronger than expected. Materials broke in places where they should not have broken. Because of this, human engineers learned to think about what could go wrong instead of only thinking about what should go right. Zix-9's crystal body glowed with a soft light as she listened to Kyle's explanation. She asked him if this meant that human engineering was better than the methods used by other species. Kyle answered carefully. He said that human engineering was not necessarily better, but it was different. It came from a different kind of experience and a different way of thinking about problems. Both approaches had value. The best engineering, Kyle suggested, might come from combining both methods together. Over the next few days, more students began to talk to Kyle and ask him questions. Some were curious, some were still skeptical, but wanted to understand his methods better. A few were even interested in learning from him. Kyle started spending time in the workshop with other students, showing them how to build prototypes and test them with their hands instead of only relying on computer calculations. One student, named Prism 7, was a young crystalline engineer who had always been very confident in his mathematical abilities. Prism 7 approached Kyle after one of the workshop sessions and admitted something that surprised Kyle. Prism 7 said that he had built a mathematical model that he was very proud of. But when he watched Kyle's prototype succeed, he realized that his model was missing something important. Prism 7 asked Kyle if he would help him understand what his calculations were not accounting for. Kyle and Prism 7 spent many hours together over the next week. Kyle would show Prism 7 how things behaved in the real physical world. Then Prism 7 would show Kyle the mathematics and ask Kyle to explain why the math did not match what Kyle had observed. Slowly, Prism 7 began to understand that mathematics was not wrong, but it was incomplete. Mathematics described ideal situations, but the real world was never ideal. By combining his mathematical knowledge with an understanding of how real materials actually behaved, Prism 7 began to develop a new approach to problem solving. Professor Aldrin noticed the changes happening in his classroom. He observed Vex beginning to ask practical questions about materials and stress. He saw Zix-9 spending time in the workshop instead of always sitting at computers. He watched as more and more students became interested in what Kyle had to teach them, not just about engineering, but about different ways of thinking. One afternoon, Professor Aldrin called Kyle into his office. The professor wanted to talk to Kyle about what was happening in the class. The professor explained that Kyle had done something very important. By showing the class a different way of thinking about engineering problems, Kyle had opened their minds to new possibilities. The professor told Kyle that this was exactly what the Institute needed. The professor said that for too long, the Institute had become focused only on theoretical perfection and mathematical elegance. They had forgotten about practical engineering and real-world application. Professor Aldrin asked Kyle a question. The professor wanted to know if Kyle would be willing to help create a new course that would teach students about practical engineering methods. The course would combine theoretical knowledge with hands-on building and testing. Kyle was surprised and honored by this request. He agreed to help, and together they began planning what this new course would look like. As the semester continued, Kyle's reputation grew throughout the Institute. Other professors heard about what Kyle had accomplished with the Pressure Distribution Challenge. Some of them were interested and wanted to learn from Kyle's methods. Others were still skeptical, but were beginning to realize that there was value in what a human from a dangerous planet could teach them. The day came when all the students received feedback on the pressure distribution assignment. Most of them had. 3 weeks after the Pressure Distribution Challenge, Professor Aldrin announced the most important assignment of the semester. He would divide the students into teams of 4, and each team would have a student from a different species. These teams had to work together to design a complete space habitat that could withstand the harsh conditions of outer space. The habitat had to be strong enough to survive solar radiation, meteorite impacts, and extreme temperature changes. It had to support life for thousands of people and have systems for recycling air and water. The deadline was 8 weeks away. When teams were assigned, Kyle found himself placed with Vex the Vexillian, Zix-9 the Silicate Engineer, and a new student named Whisper, who was a Zephyrian consciousness. Whisper was not a solid being like the others. Whisper was a being made, completely of energy and gas that floated through specially designed containers. Whisper could move through walls and could perceive energy patterns that other species could not see. This team was extremely diverse, and at first, no one thought they could work together successfully. The first team meeting happened in a special collaboration room where all 4 students sat around a circular table. Vex immediately began speaking about structural materials and physical strength. He wanted to use the strongest metals available and build walls that could resist any possible impact. Vex believed that strength was the most important factor in creating a habitat that would survive in space. He suggested building the walls so thick and heavy that nothing could ever break through them. Zix-9 had different ideas. She wanted to use elegant mathematical calculations to find the perfect balance between strength and weight. Zix-9 believed that wasting materials was inefficient and wasteful. She presented complex formulas that showed exactly how thick each wall needed to be, according to precise calculations of expected impacts and radiation levels. Zix-9 argued that her mathematical approach was superior because it used exactly the right amount of material, no more and no less. Whisper suggested using energy shields instead of physical materials. The Zephyrian explained that energy patterns could be shaped to protect the habitat more efficiently than traditional walls. Whisper believed that since energy could be controlled and adjusted, it would be better than permanent physical structures that could not be changed once they were built. Whisper proposed a design that was mostly open space protected by carefully balanced energy fields. Kyle listened to all 3 of them without interrupting. He heard their arguments and understood their different perspectives. When they finally asked what he thought, Kyle said something that surprised them all. He asked them to show him their ideas practically instead of just talking about them. He suggested that they build small models of each approach and test them. Vex thought this was a waste of time because the mathematics could already predict which design would work best. But Kyle convinced him that testing was necessary to understand what would actually work best in the real world. During the next week, Kyle worked with each team member separately to create prototypes. With Vex, Kyle built a small structure using the strongest materials available. They used thick steel and reinforced concrete and created walls that were extremely dense. Then they tested it against simulated impacts and radiation. The structure was very strong, and it survived every test without any damage. But when Kyle looked at the results, he realized something important. The structure was so heavy that it would require enormous amounts of energy to transport it to space. It would also cost so much money that only the richest civilizations could afford to build it. With Zix-9, Kyle studied her mathematical models, and together they created a more efficient design. Following her calculations precisely, they built walls that were only as thick as the mathematics said they needed to be. When they tested this structure, it also survived the simulated impacts and radiation. But then Kyle noticed something else. The structure failed in ways that the mathematics had not predicted. Small cracks appeared where the calculations said there should be no cracks. Stress concentrated in places where the math said stress should be evenly distributed. Zix-9 looked at the results and realized that her perfect calculations were not accounting for irregularities in the real materials and unexpected variations in how forces actually behaved. With Whisper, Kyle learned how energy patterns could reinforce physical materials. The Zephyrian showed Kyle how to create energy shields that could absorb and distribute impacts without using physical walls at all. When they tested this design, it worked beautifully. The energy shields bent and moved with the impacts, absorbing the force and spreading it out so that no single point took too much damage. But Kyle noticed a problem with this approach too. The energy shields required constant power to maintain them. If the power failed for even a moment, the entire habitat would be unprotected. Also, the shields could not stop everything. Very large meteorites could break through if the power was not strong enough. Then Kyle did something that changed everything. He brought all 3 prototypes together and asked each team member to examine what the other 2 had created. He wanted each student to understand both the strengths and the weaknesses of the other approaches. Vex examined Zix-9's more efficient design and realized something important. His heavy design was too wasteful, but Zix-9's efficient design was too fragile. He noticed that Zix-9's structure failed in places where a little bit of extra material could have prevented the failure. Vex realized that strength and efficiency did not have to be opposites. Sometimes adding a small amount of extra material in the right places could create a structure that was both strong and reasonably efficient. Zix-9 examined both Vex's strong design and Whisper's energy shield design. She realized that mathematics alone could not account for all the variables in the real world. She saw that Vex's heavy materials could provide the base structure, and that Whisper's energy shields could provide additional protection. She began to wonder if she could create mathematical models that incorporated both physical materials and energy patterns to create something better than what any single approach could achieve. Whisper examined Vex's heavy structure and Zix-9's efficient design with great interest. The Zephyrian realized that physical materials could provide something that energy fields could not provide. Physical materials did not require constant power to maintain their protective qualities. Even if the energy shields failed, a structure with strong physical walls would still protect the people inside. Whisper began to think about how energy shields could work together with physical materials to create redundancy and safety. Slowly and carefully, the team began to understand that their different perspectives were not in conflict with each other. They were actually complementary. Each approach had strengths and weaknesses, and by working together and learning from each other, they could create something that none of them could have created alone. Kyle became the connection between them, the person who helped translate each species' unique way of thinking into language that the others could understand. Kyle suggested that they create a new design that combined all of their ideas. The habitat would have strong physical walls made of dense materials, but these walls would be designed using Zix-9's mathematical approach to ensure they used materials efficiently. The walls would be reinforced with Whisper's energy shields to provide additional protection and to distribute impacts more effectively. The energy shields would be backed up by physical materials, so if the energy failed, the structure would still provide protection. For the next 7 weeks, the team worked together with perfect cooperation. Vex contributed his understanding of materials and structural strength. He made sure that every part of the design was strong enough to handle real impacts. Zix-9 contributed her mathematical precision and elegant calculations. She made sure that every part of the design was efficient and that the structure would not waste materials. Whisper contributed energy distribution expertise. The Zephyrian made sure that the energy shields were positioned correctly and would function effectively. Kyle contributed something that none of the others had thought to include. He built in redundancy. This meant that if one system failed, other systems could take over and keep the habitat safe. He made sure that important functions had backup systems. He designed the habitat so that damage in one area would not cause problems in other areas. He thought about what could fail and what would happen if it did. Kyle's practical thinking from Earth combined perfectly with the theoretical knowledge of his teammates. By the end of the 8th week, the team had created something remarkable. Their space habitat design combined Vex's understanding of structural integrity, Zix-9's mathematical precision, Whisper's energy manipulation techniques, and Kyle's practical engineering experience. The design was stronger than anything Vex could have imagined building alone. It was more elegant than anything Zix-9 could have calculated alone. It incorporated energy efficiency that only Whisper could have conceived, and it was built with practical redundancy and fail-safe systems that only Kyle's experience with harsh conditions had suggested. When the teams presented their designs to the entire institute, the judges were stunned. Every other team had created good. By the end of the semester, Kyle Harrison had become famous throughout the Galactic Institute. His grades were exceptional, his projects were innovative, and his ability to work with students from other species was remarkable. But not everyone was happy about this situation. Some powerful beings on the Galactic Council began to worry about what a human's presence at the Institute might mean for the future of galactic civilization. They started asking difficult questions about whether it was wise to teach advanced engineering to a human from such a dangerous planet. The Galactic Council was made up of representatives from the oldest and most powerful species in the galaxy. They met in a chamber that floated in space, surrounded by powerful energy shields and security systems. These leaders had watched humanity very carefully since humans had recently joined the galactic community. Most of them respected human military strength, but few of them trusted humans or understood human thinking. The council members had governed the galaxy for thousands of years, and they were very careful about allowing new species to gain access to advanced knowledge. One council member was a being called Executor Prime from the Vexilian species. She was much larger and more intimidating than Vex, and she had spent her entire long life thinking about strategy and power. She had commanded armies and won many wars. Executor Prime believed that humans were too unpredictable to be trusted with advanced knowledge. She argued that humans were warriors and survivors from a harsh world, and these qualities made them dangerous and unstable. She thought that if humans learned advanced engineering, they might use that knowledge in ways that threatened galactic peace and stability. Another council member was the Crystalline Consciousness, which was actually a group of connected crystal minds that spoke with one voice. This being was very logical and very cautious about change. The Crystalline Consciousness had analyzed data about human history and had concluded that humans were violent and often fought each other over resources. The consciousness believed that humans operated based on emotion and instinct rather than pure logic. It suggested that allowing humans advanced knowledge was like giving fire to children who did not understand the dangers. A third council member was the Zephyrian Elder Wind, a massive cloud of energy that had existed for thousands of years and had seen many civilizations rise and fall. Elder Wind had observed many species throughout history, and the ancient being had learned to be very cautious about change. Elder Wind was quieter than the other two council members, but also deeply skeptical, suggesting that humanity was too young and too immature to be trusted with important technology. The ancient being said that humans had only recently joined galactic civilization and had not proven themselves reliable or responsible. These three council members had requested a formal hearing about Kyle's admission to the Institute. They wanted to discuss whether it was safe and wise to teach advanced engineering to a human from such a dangerous planet. The hearing would be held in the Great Council Chamber, and the decision made there could affect not just Kyle, but the future of human participation in galactic science and education. Professor Aldrin received the summons to appear before the council and explain his decision to admit Kyle to the Institute. Professor Aldrin prepared very carefully for the hearing. He knew that this was an important moment. He collected Kyle's work, his test scores, and his project results. He documented everything that Kyle had accomplished and showed how the human had benefited the entire institute by introducing new perspectives and new ways of thinking. He gathered statements from other students and professors about how Kyle had changed their understanding of engineering. But Professor Aldrin also knew that facts and evidence might not be enough to change the council's minds. Fear and prejudice were often stronger than facts. When the hearing began, the 3 council members sat on elevated platforms, looking down at Professor Aldrin from above. Executor Prime spoke first, her voice loud and commanding. She said that humans were warriors and survivors from a harsh world. These qualities made them unpredictable and potentially dangerous. She pointed out that humans had a history of violence on Earth. They had fought wars over resources and territory. They had created weapons to destroy each other. If humans learned advanced engineering, Executor Prime argued, they might use that knowledge to create weapons or to gain power over other species. The risk was too great to take. The crystalline consciousness spoke next, its voice calm and logical. The consciousness explained that it had analyzed human psychology and human history. Humans were driven by emotions like fear, anger, and greed. They made decisions based on instinct rather than careful calculation. This made humans unreliable and dangerous. The consciousness suggested that humans did not have the mental discipline required for advanced engineering studies. Even if Kyle had succeeded so far, the consciousness argued, that was just luck or an unusual exception. Most humans would not be capable of the work, and those who were capable might use their knowledge unwisely. Elder Wind spoke last, and the ancient being's words were heavy with the weight of long experience. The Zephyrian said that it had watched many young species try to advance too quickly, and the result was always disaster. Humans, Elder Wind explained, had not been part of galactic civilization for long enough to understand the responsibilities that came with advanced knowledge. The ancient being suggested that allowing humans into advanced schools was too risky. Perhaps, Elder Wind said, humans should be kept at a lower level of technology and knowledge until they had matured enough to handle it responsibly. The ancient being's conclusion was that Kyle's admission had been a mistake, and no more humans should be allowed into advanced educational institutions. Professor Aldrin listened to all of these arguments carefully. Then he presented his case. He showed the council members Kyle's academic records and his project work. He explained that Kyle had not just passed his classes, but he had revolutionized how students at the institute thought about engineering. Professor Aldrin described the pressure distribution challenge and how Kyle's practical approach had succeeded where theoretical mathematics had failed. He explained the Space Habitat Project and how Kyle had taught students from different species to work together in ways they had never worked together before. The professor argued that education and knowledge sharing were what prevented conflict, not what caused it. When people from different species worked together and learned from each other, they developed understanding and respect. They learned that they had more in common than they had differences. Professor Aldrin suggested that keeping humans ignorant of advanced technology would not make the galaxy safer. Instead, it would create resentment and suspicion. It would suggest that humans were not trusted or respected, and that kind of treatment often led to conflict rather than preventing it. Professor Aldrin also pointed out that Kyle's presence had benefited not just Kyle, but every student at the institute. Kyle had taught students from different species how to learn from each other. Kyle had shown that practical thinking and theoretical knowledge could work together to create better solutions. Kyle had proven that different perspectives were valuable, not dangerous. The professor concluded by saying that the greatest strength of galactic civilization was the diversity of different species and different ways of thinking. By excluding humans from advanced knowledge, the council would be throwing away a valuable resource. But then something unexpected happened. A voice came from the back of the hearing chamber. Kyle asked for permission to speak before the council. Professor Aldrin looked surprised, and many people in the chamber gasped. A human speaking directly to the Galactic Council was unprecedented, but the council members, curious about what a human would say, agreed to hear from Kyle. Kyle walked forward slowly until he stood in front of the 3 council members. For a moment, everyone simply stared at him. A human in this place of power was something that had never been seen before. Kyle was young and clearly nervous, but he stood straight and spoke with a clear, strong voice. Kyle did not start with emotional appeals or arguments about fairness. Instead, he spoke about engineering principles. He explained that his species came from a dangerous planet where mistakes cost lives. Because of this, humans had learned to think about problems in ways that other species sometimes forgot to consider. Humans thought about what could fail and how to prevent those failures. Humans understood that perfect systems existed only on paper, and real systems had to be built with flexibility and redundancy. Kyle continued by saying that he was not asking the Council to trust humans because humans were good or special. He was asking the Council to respect humans because humans had useful perspectives. He pointed out that every great engineering breakthrough in the galaxy's history had come from bringing together different ways of thinking and different approaches to problems. By refusing to teach humans, the Council was not protecting the galaxy. It was actually limiting the galaxy's potential for innovation and progress. Kyle then said something that caught everyone's attention. He said that if the Council truly feared human innovation and human thinking, then that fear itself proved that humans had valuable potential. Any species that could. The graduation ceremony at the Galactic Institute happened on a day when the twin suns of the planet seemed extra bright. Hundreds of students from dozens of different species had gathered in the great amphitheater to receive their engineering certifications. The amphitheater was carved into a mountain, and the walls seemed to glow with light. Flags from every species in the galaxy hung from the ceiling, and the air was filled with excitement and celebration. Kyle Harrison sat in the front row with the other honor students. He wore the formal robes of the Institute, which had been specially fitted for a human body by the Institute's clothing specialists. The robes were beautiful and changed color as he moved, displaying the colors of every species that had contributed to his education. As he sat there waiting for his name to be called, Kyle thought about everything that had happened since he arrived at this place so many months ago. His first day seemed like it had happened years ago. He remembered being nervous and uncertain, wondering if the other students would accept him. He thought about the pressure distribution challenge and how his hands had worked to build something real when everyone else was using computers. He remembered Vex's initial coldness and how it had turned into friendship and respect. He thought about Zix-9 and how she had taught him that beauty and logic could coexist in engineering. He thought about Whisper and how energy and matter could work together in ways that Earth engineers had never considered. Kyle also thought about Professor Aldrin and how the professor had taken a risk by admitting him to the Institute. He thought about the council hearing and the three powerful beings who had doubted whether humans deserved to learn advanced knowledge. He thought about his own speech to the council and how frightened he had been standing before such ancient and powerful beings. Yet he had found the courage to speak, and his words had made a difference. Then Kyle's name was called. He stood up and walked to the stage where the president of the Institute was waiting. The president was a being called Chancellor Thorne, who was from the oldest species in the galaxy, and had been leading the Institute for over 200 years. Chancellor Thorne looked at Kyle with ancient eyes that had seen many students graduate, but few who had changed the Institute as much as this human had. Chancellor Thorne gave Kyle his certification and spoke words of praise about his achievements. The Chancellor explained that Kyle had not just been an excellent student. Kyle had been a bridge between different species and different ways of thinking. Kyle had shown that learning from someone completely different from yourself could lead to extraordinary innovation and progress. But then the Chancellor said something that shocked many of the people in the amphitheater. Chancellor Thorne announced that Kyle had been offered a teaching position at the Institute. Kyle would become the first human professor at the school. He would teach a course called Advanced Engineering Under Pressure, which would examine how different species approached problems when circumstances were dangerous and failure was not an option. Kyle would design the course curriculum himself and would have complete freedom to teach in whatever way he believed would be most effective. The amphitheater erupted in applause and cheers. The sound was enormous and filled the entire mountain valley. Vex stood up and bellowed a sound of approval that echoed off the mountain walls. His armored body made a thunderous noise as he stood. Zix-9's crystal body flashed with bright colors that sparkled and shone in the light. Whisper's energy form danced and spiraled through the air in patterns of pure joy. Hundreds of other students cheered as well. Even some of the professors in the audience stood up and applauded. Kyle felt tears in his eyes, something that his alien friends had learned was very human and very beautiful. On Earth, humans cried, when they felt strong emotions, both sad emotions and happy emotions. Kyle's friends had learned to recognize this as a sign of deep feeling and genuine emotion. They had learned to respect this very human way of expressing what was in the heart. That evening, after the ceremony ended and all the celebrations had finished, Kyle walked alone through the Institute's corridors. The hallways were quiet and peaceful in the late evening. Most students had gone to their dormitories or had left the Institute to celebrate with their families. Kyle made his way to his new office, which was part of the professor's building. It was a space that was now his own. The office was beautiful and much larger than his student dormitory room had been. It had windows that looked out over the entire institute. From his window, Kyle could see the research buildings where scientists worked on important problems. He could see the student housing where his friends were probably celebrating. He could see the great amphitheater where he had just received his certification. He could see the garden where students studied and relaxed during their free time. Kyle had not yet moved all his belongings into the office, but a few personal items were already on the desk. There was a picture of Earth that Kyle had brought from home, showing the blue oceans and the green continents. There was also a photograph of Kyle with Vex, Zix9, and Whisper, taken on the day their team won the space habitat design competition. Kyle looked at these items and felt a deep sense of satisfaction and accomplishment. Kyle sat in his office chair and thought about what his success meant for humanity. 3 more humans had been admitted to the Institute this year, and the applications from Earth were arriving every day. Soon there might be hundreds of human students studying at schools across the galaxy. Kyle realized that his path here had not been just about his own education. It had been about opening a door for an entire species to join the galactic community in a meaningful way. He had opened that door, and now other humans were beginning to walk through it. Kyle opened his computer and started preparing his first lecture. He wanted to create a course that would teach students from all species how to think like an engineer from Earth. He wanted to share the lessons that harsh conditions and survival had taught humanity. He wanted to help the galaxy understand that being different was not a weakness, but a strength. He wanted to show students that practical experience combined with theoretical knowledge created the best solutions to difficult problems. Kyle worked late into the night planning the first lecture. He decided that he would start by asking students to think about what happens when engineering fails. He would ask them to consider what happens when a bridge collapses, or when a ship sinks, or when a machine breaks down at a critical moment. He would explain how human engineers learned to build systems that could handle failures without causing disaster. Kyle also planned to have students build prototypes and test them, just as he had done when he first arrived at the Institute. He believed that learning by doing was important. He believed that students needed to understand not just the theory, but also how real systems actually behaved in real conditions. He planned to create an environment where students from different species could work together and learn from each other's perspectives. As Kyle worked, he thought about the most important lesson he had learned during his time at the Institute. The lesson was not about engineering formulas or mathematical calculations. The lesson was about the power of diversity and cooperation. The lesson was that the best solutions came when different minds worked together. It did not matter if those minds came from different species or had different ways of thinking. Difference was not a problem to be solved. Difference was a resource to be used. Kyle also thought about the challenges that other human students would face when they arrived at the Institute. They would probably experience the same doubt and skepticism that Kyle had experienced. Other students might not believe they belonged here. Other species might think humans were not smart enough or not mature enough or too emotional to be good engineers. Kyle decided that one of his most important jobs would be to help human students understand that their different perspective was valuable. He would help them see that coming from a dangerous planet was not a weakness, but a source of strength. As the sun came up the next morning, Kyle was still sitting at his desk, surrounded by notes and plans for his course. His first lecture would be in 1 week. He was nervous but also excited. He knew that this course would be important. He knew that it would challenge his students to think in new ways. He knew that it would change the Institute just as he had changed it as a student. Kyle also received a message from Earth that morning. It was from a group of human scientists and engineers who wanted to establish a research partnership between Earth universities and the Galactic Institute. The message explained that humans on Earth were excited about what Kyle had accomplished and wanted to contribute to galactic science and technology. They were ready to share Earth's knowledge and eager to learn from the galaxy's knowledge. Kyle read this message and felt a deep sense of satisfaction and hope. He had not just changed his own life by coming to the Institute. He had opened a door for his entire species. He had shown the galaxy that humans were not just warriors or resource competitors. Humans were thinkers and builders and learners. Humans had unique perspectives and valuable contributions to make in every area of knowledge and science. Kyle stood up and walked to the window of his office. The classroom on the first day of Kyle's new course was packed with far more students than had ever sat in this room before. Word had spread across the entire institute that a human professor was teaching a class about engineering from a Deathworld perspective. Nearly 300 students from dozens of different species wanted to attend, even though the classroom only had seats for 150 people. Additional standing room had been created, and students floated or hovered in the air to watch and listen. Kyle stood in front of the classroom and looked out at all these faces. They were so different from each other. Some had eyes made of crystal that could see wavelengths of light that human eyes could never perceive. Some had no eyes at all and perceived their surroundings through other senses that humans did not possess. Some had skin, some had armor, some had scales, and some were made of energy or flowing liquid. But all of them were here to listen to what Kyle had to teach them. Kyle began his lecture by asking a simple question. He asked the students to define the word failure. Students raised their hands and various answers came forward. Failure was not meeting expectations. Failure was not achieving the goal. Failure was making a mistake. Kyle nodded at each answer and said they were all correct. But then Kyle told them that on Earth, failure had a more important meaning. Kyle explained that on Earth, failure often meant death. If you built a bridge badly and it collapsed, the people on that bridge died. If you designed a ship poorly and it sank in a storm, the people on that ship drowned. If you created medicine incorrectly and people took it, they became sick or died. Because of this, human engineers learned to build things with many backup systems. They built things that could fail in one place without failing everywhere. They built things that were stronger than the minimum strength required because they understood that real conditions were always worse than the calculations predicted. Kyle then showed the students the prototype he had built for his first assignment at the Institute. He explained every decision he had made and why he had made it. He pointed out where he had added extra material to provide redundancy. He showed them where he had designed the system to fail slowly rather than all at once. He explained how he had made the system flexible so that if one part broke, the other parts could still function. The students were fascinated. They asked Kyle many questions. Why would you add extra material when that made the system heavier and more expensive? Kyle answered that in a real emergency, that extra material might be the difference between survival and death. Why would you design something to fail slowly instead of all at once? Kyle explained that slow failure gave people time to escape or repair the problem, while sudden failure left no time for anything. One student asked if Kyle thought that humans were better engineers than other species, because humans came from a dangerous planet. Kyle answered very carefully. He said that humans were not necessarily better, but they were definitely different. They thought about problems in ways that species from safer worlds sometimes forgot to think about. They valued redundancy and flexibility in ways that might seem wasteful to other species. They understood that perfection was impossible, and that good enough was sometimes the best you could do in real conditions. During the second part of the lecture, Kyle showed students examples from history. He showed them the history of aviation on Earth, where engineers had learned through many crashes and deaths how to build safer planes. He showed them the history of bridge building, where engineers had learned from catastrophic failures how to design better structures. He showed them the history of medicine, where researchers had learned from terrible mistakes how to create better treatments and medicines. Kyle explained that every failure had been a teacher, and humans had learned valuable lessons from each one. A young crystalline engineer named Prism 8 stood up and asked an important question. Prism 8 wanted to know if other species could also learn this way. Could scientists from other worlds learn to think like Deathworld engineers? Kyle smiled and said that this was exactly why he wanted to teach this course. He believed that any intelligent species could learn from any other intelligent species. The question was whether they were willing to open their minds to different perspectives and different ways of thinking. Kyle then announced the first assignment for his course. He gave every student the same problem. They had to design a system that would maintain life support for 1,000 people in space. But there was a challenge. The system had to keep people alive even if one major component failed completely. Half of the students could use computers and mathematical calculations. The other half had to build a physical prototype like Kyle had done. Kyle explained that he wanted to see what different approaches would produce and what could be learned from comparing them. When students began working on the assignment, something interesting happened. The students who were building prototypes started asking the students who were doing calculations to explain their math. The students doing calculations started watching the students building prototypes and asking why they made certain choices. Kyle had created an environment where different ways of thinking had to work together. He encouraged cooperation instead of competition between the two groups. By the end of the week, something remarkable had happened. The students who had built prototypes had created systems that were stronger and more flexible than the purely mathematical designs. The students who had done calculations had created systems that were more efficient than the prototypes. But the students who had combined both approaches had created something beautiful. They had created systems that were both mathematically elegant and practically robust. Kyle gathered all the students and showed them the best designs from each category. He asked them to explain why the combined approach worked better than either approach alone. Prismate explained that mathematics showed you what should happen in perfect conditions, but prototypes showed you what actually happened in real conditions. By combining them, you discovered the gap between theory and reality, and that gap was where the most important lessons lived. Kyle smiled and told the entire class that this was exactly what he hoped they would learn. Engineering was not just mathematics or just building things. Engineering was the art of combining all possible ways of thinking to solve real problems in the real world. And the best engineers, Kyle said, were the ones who could learn from species and perspectives that were completely different from their own way of thinking. Kyle also introduced a new teaching method that surprised many students. He required every group project to include students from at least 3 different species. He believed that diversity in teams created better solutions and more innovative thinking. At first, some students were uncomfortable working with beings so different from themselves. But as the weeks went by, they started to see the value of having different perspectives represented in their projects. One group had a Vexillian who contributed strong structural thinking, a Zephyrian who could perceive energy patterns, a silicate engineer who provided mathematical precision, and 2 human students who suggested practical solutions based on real-world experience. When this group presented their project, they had created something that combined the strengths of all 5 different species and perspectives. The design was stronger, more efficient, and more innovative than anything any single species could have created alone. As the weeks went by, Kyle's course became the most popular class at the Institute. Students who did not even need the course for their degrees attended the lectures. Other professors started coming to listen to Kyle teach. Graduate students used his course as a model for how they wanted to teach their own classes. Some professors even started incorporating practical work into their theoretical courses, copying Kyle's methods. Kyle also noticed that the Institute itself was changing because of his presence and his teaching. Professors started requiring students to work in mixed species study groups. The strict separation between different types of engineering was becoming less rigid, and people were starting to see connections between disciplines that they had never noticed before. The rigid hierarchy of species-based academic tracks had been dismantled in favor of merit-based progression, where all students were judged on their abilities rather than their species. Most importantly, more humans had arrived at the Institute and they were thriving. Some were studying engineering, but others were studying other subjects like mathematics, physics, biology, and art. They were proving that humans could contribute to many different fields, not just engineering. They were proving that humanity had something valuable to offer in every area of knowledge. Other human students started following Kyle's example and becoming teachers and mentors to alien students, helping them understand human perspectives. One day, Kyle received a message from Earth. It was from a group of human scientists and engineers who wanted to establish a research partnership between Earth universities and the Galactic Institute. The message explained that humans on Earth were excited about what Kyle had accomplished and wanted to contribute to galactic science and technology. They were ready to share Earth's knowledge and eager to learn from the galaxy's knowledge. They wanted to send more human